Who can better make music than our youth? May they play on forever. A heartfelt thanks to the Concord Carlisle High School Orchestra and to their conductor and director, Scott Knupp, for starting us off this evening. Good evening, my name is Stuart Weeks. On behalf of the Steinberg-Lally Charitable Foundation and the Concord Historical Commission, I welcome you to this celebration. It has been a pleasure to have worked with Steve Steinberg, whose vision and generosity has made this evening possible, as well as with many of the individuals you will hear from tonight in the coordination of this bicentennial celebration of the birth of Abraham Lincoln, one of our greatest and most beloved public servants. From Ronald Reagan to Barack Obama, many seek to wear Lincoln's mantle. Lincoln has achieved mythic, saintly proportions. Today, scholars, authors, and students of Lincoln maintain that beyond his acknowledged and laudable attributes stands a fellow human being who, in his own words, wrestled no less with the better angel of his nature in order to overcome the limitations that belong to all of us mortals. To that struggle, Abraham Lincoln gave his own last full measure of devotion. The legacy of Lincoln is that the Civil War achieved two irrefutable results. Slavery was abolished, and this country, hitherto composed of ungovernable states and localities, became in time a unified nation, governed by central authority. Upon conclusion of this war, the commonplace plural, the United States are a nation, disappeared. Thenceforth, the world would adhere to the singular, the United States, we the people, is a nation. As such, a celebration only occurs indeed every 200 years, in the nick of time with respect to the problems, challenges, and above all, the opportunities facing our nation today. We have a rich and full evening ahead of you, one that we trust will do justice to our 16th president, great and good spirit. We invite you to sit back and enjoy. We'll begin with the Concord Carlisle Select Chorus and their director, Deborah Smith.
Of Do, 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 swing.
Swing down, chariot, stop and let me ride. Swing down, chariot, stop and let me ride. Oh, rock me, Lord, calm and easy. I've got a home on the other side. Swing down, chariot, stop and let me ride. Swing down, chariot, stop and let me ride. Oh, rock me, Lord, calm and easy. I've got a home on the other side. Well, Ezekiel went out in the middle of a field. He saw an angel working on a chariot wheel. He wasn't particular about chariot wheel. He just wanted to see how a chariot feels.
Well, Ezekiel went down and he got on board. The chariot went a-bumping on down that old road. He wasn't particular about the bumping of the road. He just wanted to lay down his
heavy load. Swing down, chariot, stop and let me ride. Swing down, chariot, stop and let me ride. Oh, rock me, Lord, calm and easy. I've got a home on the other side. A sinner, he went out in the middle of a field. He started working on a chariot wheel. He wasn't so particular about working on that wheel. He just wants to see how a chariot feels.
Then an angel saw the sinner working hard there in the field. He said, hold on, believer, easy, you'll rise that wheel. The chariot will swing on down that old and bumpy road. The chariot's the place to lay your
heavy load. Swing down, chariot, stop and let me ride. Swing down, chariot, stop and let me ride. Oh, rock me, Lord, calm and easy. I've got a home on the other side. Swing down, chariot, stop and let me ride. Swing down, chariot, stop and let me ride. Oh, rock me, Lord, calm and easy. I've got a home on the other side. Swing down, chariot, and let me ride. Swing down, chariot, and let me ride. Swing down, chariot, and let me ride. I've got a home, I've got a home, I've got a home on the other side.
To Lincoln and the concept of the self-made man, Jacob Lundberg, Professor of History at Sacred Heart University.
Abraham Lincoln towers above the public men of the 19th century. He has the unique distinction of being credited, whether deserved or not, with some fairly major achievements like saving the Union and ending slavery. Even if his resume up to the Civil War is pretty thin, the genius with which he handled our greatest national crisis places him far above the public figures of his generation. This being said, I have to say that old Honest Abe, to me at least, is a disappointment in one important respect. The 19th century was, without question, the golden age of facial hair, and our national hero seems to have missed out on an opportunity. He could have not only been our greatest president, but he also might have merited special treatment on popular contemporary blogs such as Mustaches of the 19th Century. Now, I know what you're thinking. Lincoln had a beard. We think of him as a man with a beard. This is true, but to my mind, it's a fairly unspectacular one. Technically speaking, in the taxonomy of these things, this was called a chin curtain. Just move this back here a little bit. This is fine, but I think it pales in comparison to some of the arrangements that some of his contemporaries came up with. Just think of General Ambrose E. Burnside of the original Sideburn. So general, but I think fairly successful in the realm of facial hair. Or what about the neckbeards of the New York Tribune editor Horace Greeley and local weirdo Henry David Thoreau? What about Frederick Douglass, whose carefully groomed goatee created a striking contrast with the perfectly ordered madness of his mane? Or John Brown, the would-be revolutionary who tried to single-handedly take down slavery just before the Civil War. It didn't work, but he went out in Old Testament style. Now, if we trace Lincoln's image in photographs, we see that he, in fact, compromised and experimented on a variety of looks, from the clean-shaven to the chin curtain to compromised positions in between. He did have a special challenge. He is hardly our best-looking president. As looks go, he is no Franklin Pierce. But perhaps he was just doing what he had to do. Now, even if Lincoln didn't achieve the heights of a Burnside or a John Brown in his facial hair, his variety of looks and arrangements through the years demonstrates that he, like his contemporaries, spent some time thinking about this distinctly 19th century form of self-presentation. And it begs a question. What was it with these guys? Why is it that when we look into those ghost-like daguerreotypes of Lincoln's day, so often the guy in the middle has some kind of crazy beard, mustache, set of mutton chops, or absent facial hair, some hairdo that immediately tells us we've crossed the border into a very strange and very foreign land? Well, on one level, the easy answer is that styles, especially various hairstyles, are always changing and can easily stand as the mark of a certain place or a certain time. But I think the case in the world of public men in 19th century America goes a little deeper than that. I think it has something to do with what I came here to talk about tonight, the idea of the self-made man. People are always conscious and aware of how they present, how they create, how they make themselves. But American men in the age of Lincoln seem to have been especially concerned with these questions. In a world that saw the emergence of the first mass medium in the newspaper, the expansion of voting rights, and new levels of political interest and participation among white men, and of course the development of photography, the problem of self-presentation took on new and unexpected dimensions. The result was that the America in which Lincoln came of age and rose to prominence was a place that presented new technologies, new media, new opportunities, and indeed new imperatives for self-presentation and self-creation. Living in mid-19th century America was kind of like going into a photographic studio for the first time. You were forced to think about how you would make and present yourself in new and unprecedented ways. It is perhaps no wonder then that this was a golden age for experimentation with facial hair, and also that it was a golden age of what we have come to call the self-made man. Now, the idea of the self-made man is a distinctly and uniquely American one. We love to tell ourselves the stories of those who have risen to prominence from obscure or unlikely backgrounds. And nowadays, when we talk about the self-made man, we are usually talking about somebody who has succeeded in business, somebody who has gone, as we say, from rags to riches. But when people talked about the self-made man in 19th century America, they weren't talking about entrepreneurs and businessmen. They were talking about people like Lincoln. They were talking about people who had risen from obscurity to prominence and importance in a way that transcended wealth. When one author published a volume of 60 biographical sketches of self-made men in 1858, few of them were entrepreneurs. When Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a book on the lives and deeds of our self-made men in 1872, she found people like Lincoln who had been men of a certain moral influence, as she put it. None of her exemplary characters were notable for making money. These were men who had worked to cultivate and construct themselves in such a way as to leave their mark on the world and to stand as a model and exemplar to others of what was possible with proper determination and self-improvement. Thus, self-made men were stories as much as they were people, and self-making was a style as much as it was a substance. And in the age of the self-made man, no one was better at telling the story, no one was better at deploying the style than Abraham Lincoln. He may not have been as adventurous or as successful as some of his contemporaries in constructing his image through his facial hair, but he beat them all out in making himself as a self-made man. Now, most aspects of the Lincoln self-made legend are indeed true. His parents were poor and uneducated. They welcomed him into the world in what I think of as a log cabin. I'm not sure if this is true. I don't think Christopher Hitchens necessarily knows anything about Abraham Lincoln. But in any case, he bounced around in his youth in what he called an unbroken forest, and there he learned his legendary skills wielding an axe, and I'm sure he did, in fact, split a few rails along the way. He was largely self-taught, and there are all kinds of stories about him marching for 15 miles to go and get a book just so that he could read it, and he probably did read it by the firelight. That is possible. So much of the story is, in fact, true. And he eventually was able to sort of pull himself up by the bootstraps. He had some rough years in there as a young man. He did turns as a store clerk, as a postmaster, a surveyor, a mill hand, a hired laborer. And eventually, he taught himself to be a lawyer. And he got to a point where he was making a comfortable $1,200 a year, which is about what a state governor would have made in those days. And on that basis alone, he seemed to have made himself in a sort of storybook rise from the grim, impoverished circumstances of his youth. But as his longtime law partner, William Herndon, knew well, Lincoln wanted more than material comfort, and he was determined that his story not end there. Lincoln wanted to make his mark on the world. He was always, as Herndon wrote, the man who thinks Lincoln calmly gathered his robes about him, waiting for the people to call him, has a very erroneous knowledge of Lincoln. He was always calculating, planning ahead. His ambition was a little engine that knew no rest. End quote. It was an ambition that drove him to seek political office for much of his life. And from the moment Lincoln announced his intentions to enter public life as a candidate for the Illinois State Legislature in 1832, he seemed to have a clear sense of the utility of his lowly roots. After laying out a program of economic development, the kind of program that would have been to the benefit of a poor lad such as he had been, he told his audience, quote, "I was born and have ever remained in the most humble walks of life. I have no wealthy or popular relations to recommend me." It was a plea that he would make in one form or another in many of the public statements and his speeches over the remainder of his political career. Lincoln staked his advancement on his humble roots because he was keenly aware of the power of his own narrative as a self-made man. And this was in the context of what one contemporary called a country of self-made men. As the great historian Richard Hofstadter nicely summed it up, quote, "The first author of the Lincoln legend and the greatest of the Lincoln dramatists was Lincoln himself." But the Lincoln legend would be far less compelling if Lincoln hadn't believed in the substance behind the self-made style. The self-made man was not merely a part that Lincoln played. Rather, the very idea formed the most basic article of his political faith from his beginnings in public life. What he called the right to rise, the ability to improve one's condition, would guide his return to politics in the 1850s. It would define his revulsion to slavery, and it would form the basis for his understanding of the Civil War. From his earliest days in politics, Lincoln had looked to government to create opportunity through education, infrastructure, economic development, and banking. In the name of that political vision, he joined the hoity-toity Whig Party in an age when working men and other pieces of floating driftwood were supposed to follow Andrew Jackson into the Democratic Party. Writing in 1843 to an old friend from New Salem, Illinois, Lincoln suggested that his allegiance to the Whigs would, quote, "astonish, if not amuse, the older citizens of that county, who 12 years ago knew me as a strange, friendless, uneducated, penniless boy working on a flatboat at $10 a month to learn that I have been put down here as the candidate of pride, wealth, and aristocratic family distinction." Now, of course, Lincoln's background made such charges laughable, but he was willing to take them because the Whig Party offered a program of improvement in the spirit of the original self-made man, Henry Clay. It was natural that self-taught young men like Lincoln should gravitate toward a party that affirmed their stories and offered others hope for others to follow them. Now, when Senator Stephen A. Douglas, who I gather we're going to be hearing from in a few minutes, When Douglas passed his infamous Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, effectively repealing the Missouri Compromise and threatening to open the West up to slavery, Lincoln found a voice of moral force and clarity that would begin his rise to national prominence. At the heart of the dissent that he would develop through the remainder of the 1850s was an impassioned defense of the process and promise of self-making. The abstract threat that slave labor may be allowed to take root in the West made Lincoln articulate his core principle, once again in direct reference to his own self-made narrative. Quote, "There is no permanent class of hired laborers among us," he wrote in a fragment in 1854, just after the passage of Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska bill. 25 years ago, I was a hired laborer. The hired laborer of yesterday labors on his own account today and will hire others to labor for him tomorrow. Advancement, improvement in condition, is the order of things in a society of equals." End quote. 6 years later, in 1860, we can hear Lincoln, now a seasoned veteran at fighting the spread of slavery, incorporate this idea into a speech before a crowd of workers in New Haven, Connecticut. Quote, "While we do not propose any war upon capital, we do wish to allow the humblest man an equal chance to get rich with everybody else. When one starts poor, as one must do in the race of life, free society is such that he knows he can better his condition. He knows that there is no fixed condition of labor for his whole life." Holding up his own model, Lincoln continued, "I am not ashamed to confess that 25 years ago, I was a hired laborer, mauling rails, at work on a flatboat. I want every man to have a chance. That is the true system." Now, as the sectional conflict between the North and the South became a sectional crisis and eventually a civil war, Lincoln found the same moral clarity through the affirmation of this true system of improvement and self-making. From his earliest days as a wartime commander-in-chief, he understood the fight as one to both save the Union and the right to rise on which he believed it to be fundamentally premised. When he famously told Congress in his 4th of July message in 1861 that the fight was, quote, "essentially a people's contest," he meant that it was a contest to defend and affirm the people's right to do what he had done. Quote, "On the side of the Union, it is a struggle for maintaining in the world that form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear paths of laudable pursuits for all, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life." End quote. And when he addressed Congress later that year, in December of 1861, Lincoln again framed the fight as one to save that prosperous system, this time using that creed to validate his own leadership and to give meaning to the sacrifices of armies of self-made men. Quote, "No men living are more worthy to be trusted than those who toil up from poverty. Let them beware of surrendering a political power which they already possess, and which, if surrendered, will surely close the door of advancement against such as they, and to fix new disabilities and burdens upon them, till all of liberty shall be lost." End quote. Now, as we look back now, we might easily criticize Lincoln's commitment to the self-making creed. In a world defined by massive disparities of wealth, hardened class boundaries, and complex, impersonal, and seemingly uncontrollable economic forces, there is something almost hokey and naive about his claims of constant advancement and improvement. And most glaring, if we ask who Lincoln meant to include when he spoke of the joys and glories of toiling up from poverty, we will surely be disappointed with the answers. Slavery came to form a central part of Lincoln's affirmation of self-making, especially after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Whether it is as an abstract or imminent threat, slavery stood out as an intolerable negation of Lincoln's self-making creed. As an eternally fixed condition, slavery robbed labor of its dignity and promise. It denied the possibility of advancement, and it eliminated the possibility of self-creation. But his outrage at this idea initially seems to have only been on behalf of those of his own ilk, white men like himself who could toil up from poverty and legitimately expect rewards. But let us remember that for Lincoln, this was a powerful and progressive vision of the world. And even as he never gave up on his belief to the right to rise and self-create, his creed evolved as circumstances grew more complex. By the time the Civil War was drawing to a close, after he had called for a new birth of freedom, he had come to recognize slavery as a national sin and a blight on his creed. His Old Testament-style prophecy that the war would continue as a punishment for the collective hypocrisy of slavery reminds us that until the moment of his death, Lincoln remained not merely self-made, but continually self-making. Thank you.
Songs and Poems with Dillon Bustin. Many remember him here as the former director of the Emerson Umbrella, where he did fine work here in Concord, and his colleague Jacquelin Schwab on the piano. Welcome.
I was raised in Indiana, where an essential part of every fourth grader's education was a field trip to Lincoln National Memorial in Spencer County near Gentryville, and also right across the road, Lincoln Boyhood State Park, where a replica of his childhood log cabin was. 2 weeks ago, I was reading Newsweek magazine, and there was an opinion piece by Christopher Hitchens in which, along with several other provocative things, he made the assertion that Abraham Lincoln never lived in a log cabin. And I was sitting at my kitchen table, saying, what shall I do with this slander? He never lived in a log cabin. And my wife said, why don't you write a letter to the editor? And I said, no, well, no, I'm not going to do that. They never print it. But last week, there was a letter from the governor of Indiana to Newsweek, Mitch Daniels, inviting Christopher Hitchens to join him for a tour of Lincoln Boyhood State Park. Anyway, when Lincoln was about 18, he sang at his sister's wedding. He had an older sister, just two or 3 years older. I believe her name was Elizabeth. She was getting married. She asked him to sing the anthem. And he sang a song called The Wedding Song of Adam and Eve, which is from the hymnal that was used locally. It was called the Missouri Harmony, and it was published in 1811. And it was one of those really old-fashioned shape notation type of hymnals. So I would like to sing for you the wedding song of Adam and Eve. If you can imagine Abe at the age of 18 singing this for his sister and her groom. When Adam was created, he dwelt in Eden's shade, as Moses has recorded before an Eve was made. 10,000 times 10,000 of creatures swarmed around, and yet no mate was formed, and yet no bride was found. The Lord then was not willing that man should live alone, but caused a sleep upon him and took from him a bone. He closed the flesh in that place, and then he took the same, and of it made a woman, and brought her to the man. Then Adam he rejoiced to see his loving bride, a part of his own body, the product of his side. This woman was not taken from Adam's head, we know, to show she must not rule him, 'tis evidently so. This woman was not taken from Adam's feet, we see, so he must not abuse her, the meaning seems to be. This woman, she was taken from under Adam's arm, so she must be protected from injuries and harm. I'd like to introduce my close colleague, Jacquelin Schwab, who will accompany me as I read a poem by Abraham Lincoln. I believe it was in 1840, after he had lived in Illinois for many years, he returned to Gentryville in Indiana. Actually, it was 1844 while he was campaigning for Henry Clay. And he was deeply moved to see this spot where he had spent his boyhood. His sister had died just a few years after her marriage, and of course his mother had died when he was 7 there, his biological mother. So he was moved to write this poem, which is called My Childhood Home. My childhood home I see again, and sadden with the view, and still as memory crowds my brain, there's pleasure in it too. O memory, thou midway world twixt earth and paradise, where things decayed and loved ones lost in dreamy shadows rise, and freed from all that's earthly vile seems hallowed, pure and bright, like scenes in some enchanted isle, all bathed in liquid light. As dusky mountains please the eye when twilight chases day, as bugle notes that passing by in distance die away, as leaving some grand waterfall we, lingering, list its roar, so memory will hallow all we've known but know no more. Near 20 years have passed away since here I bid farewell to woods and fields and scenes of play and playmates loved so well, where many were but few remain of old familiar things, but seeing them to mind again the lost and absent brings. The friends I left the parting day, how changed as time has sped. Young childhood grown, strong manhood gray, and half of all are dead. I hear the loved survivors tell how naught from death could save, till every sound appears a knell and every spot a grave. I range the fields with pensive tread and pace the hollow rooms and feel, companion to the dead, that I am living in the tombs. Oh yes, Flow Gently, Sweet Afton, 2 tunes known to be favorites of Lincoln. I'm going to ask Jacquelin to play a solo now of a campaign tune, and this is called the Rail Splitters Polka. You know, when they were searching for a new identity for Abe when he was running for president, something beyond Honest Abe, which he didn't really care for, there was a big Whig convention, and Lincoln's cousin, Dennis Hanks, showed up with a banner that was suspended between 2 fence rails, which Lincoln himself had hewed out, split out, 25 or 30 years earlier. He'd actually gone out to the fence and taken the rails and brought them to this convention. So immediately, he was the Illinois rail splitter. And this, probably they hired some composer to compose the rail splitter's polka. Read one more poem. This is actually a continuation of that first one. One thing that was most forcibly remembered to Lincoln when he was home was a friend of his, a childhood friend, I think his name was Matthew Gentry, who went stark raving mad, became a lunatic, as they would have said, or became insane when he was about 17 or 18. No doubt today the diagnosis would be schizophrenia. And as often the case with schizophrenia as we know it now, there might be an initial phase which is very agitated and very violent, and then gradually the symptoms become more subdued. And that happened to his friend Matthew, who is still alive, living in the vicinity when Lincoln visited in 1844. And he recalled that, in the beginning, he seemed very dangerous to those around him, but as he went into the more subdued phase, he would moan and groan all night. And Lincoln would get up and walk down through the woods near that family's cabin just to listen to him sing in his way. But by this time, he was really suffering from depression, and it shows in this poem. And she'll go into something happier called The Milltown Maid. But here's an object more of dread than aught the grave contains. A human form with reason fled, while wretched life remains. Poor Matthew, once of genius bright, a fortune-favored child, now locked for aye in mental night, a haggard madman wild. Poor Matthew, I have ne'er forgot when first with maddened will yourself you maimed, your father fought, your mother strove to kill. When terror spread and neighbors ran, your dangerous strength to bind, and soon a howling crazy man your limbs were fast confined. How then you strove and shrieked aloud, your bones and sinews bared, and fiendish on the gazing crowd with burning eyeballs glared, and begged and swore and wept and prayed, with maniac laughter joined. How fearful were those signs displayed by pangs that killed the mind. And when at length, though drear and long, time soothed thy fiercer woes, how plaintively thy mournful song upon the still night rose. I've heard it oft as if I dreamed, far distant, sweet and lone, the funeral dirge, it ever seemed, of reason dead and gone. To drink its strains I've stole away, all stealthily and still, yet the rising god of day had streaked the eastern hill. Air held his breath, trees with the spell seemed sorrowing angels round, whose swelling tears in dewdrops fell upon the listening ground. But this is past, and naught remains that raise thee o'er a brute. Thy piercing shrieks and soothing strains are like forever mute. Now fare thee well, more thou the cause than subject now of woe. All mental pangs by time's kind laws hast lost the power to know. O death, thou awe-inspiring prince that keep'st the world in fear, why dost thou tear more blessed ones hence and leave him lingering here?
Thank you. We've given our speakers perhaps the impossible task of taking 5 times as long as Lincoln took for his Gettysburg Address to get to the heart of the issue, so that we're not here till midnight. So we'll see how we do, but thank you very much. And our next speaker, we go from what Lincoln looked like to what did Lincoln sound like. Professor David Zarefsky from Northwestern University, someone who's come a good distance to be with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. We have very little information about what Lincoln's voice sounded like. The technology of photography had advanced during his lifetime, but the technology of voice recording had not. So most of our evidence comes from recollections of people who had heard him speak on various occasions. And their recollections are fairly consistent. His voice was high-pitched. It was nasal. There was a Kentucky twang to his voice. And yet his delivery was forceful. It was often described as piercing. He was able to be heard for some distance without benefit of microphone. But what people most often commented on about his voice was its sometimes animated quality as he displayed his wit, his sense of humor, and his ability to relate to the people in his audience. In a deeper sense, though, we know quite a bit about Lincoln's voice, and it's interesting to note that many of the recent books that have been published about Lincoln make reference to the power of his voice. There is Douglas Wilson's Lincoln's Sword, the Presidency and the Power of Words. Ronald White's The Eloquent President. Fred Kaplan's Lincoln, the Biography of a Writer. Allen Guelzo, Lincoln and Douglas, The Debates That Defined America. Harold Holzer, Lincoln at Cooper Union, The Speech That Made Abraham Lincoln President. Gary Wills, Lincoln at Gettysburg, The Words That Remade America. There was something of great power in Lincoln's words. He wrote for the ear. He wrote with a sense of how his words would sound, and in that sense, his voice was particularly profound. All of us, I'm sure, remember some of the most famous of Lincoln's phrases from his most formal public addresses, even though we sometimes remember them out of context. We remember his biblical quotation, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," even though we may not remember that he wasn't using those words to predict civil war. We remember from the Cooper Union speech, the line that we saw just a few moments ago, "With faith that right makes might, let us do our duty as we understand it." From his first inaugural address, we remember, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." We remember the line that President Obama quoted in his victory speech, "Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection," and the reference to the mystic chords of memory. From his 1862 annual message, the State of the Union message, an otherwise prosaic and pedestrian message, we remember, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, we must think anew and act anew. We cannot escape history. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we receive." From the Gettysburg Address, we remember, of course, 77 years ago. We remember, "Conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." We remember, "A new birth of freedom and government of the people, by the people, for the people." Lincoln accented it that way, not on the prepositions. And from the second inaugural address, we remember, "With malice toward none, with charity for all." So we know that Lincoln had a great ability to turn a phrase, to create what in today's idiom would be called sound bites, memorable phrases that captured meaning in nuggets of words. And of course, the power of those words for us is that they continue to convey meaning for us, even if not exactly the same meaning that Lincoln had in mind. But most of Lincoln's remarks were not formal public addresses. Until he became president, he typically spoke extemporaneously. And the most extemporaneous of all his speeches were the ones that were delivered during the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And so I thought it might be interesting for us to see how the power of Lincoln's voice in his words was deployed in the debates. And I'd like to share several examples with you. And remember, this is unscripted Lincoln. This is not rehearsed. This is not a formal speech. There is no manuscript. Lincoln was known as a storyteller. And indeed, narrative was one aspect of his voice that he used to great effect. At one point, Douglas was berating him for opposing the Dred Scott decision, claiming that by doing that, he was bringing disrespect on the Supreme Court and on the rule of law. And so Lincoln told a story. He remembered that some years before in Illinois, there had been a decision of the Illinois Supreme Court that Douglas had objected to. And in the Quincy debate, the sixth debate, Lincoln strings the story together with a series of questions. Didn't Judge Douglas find a way to reverse the decision of our Supreme Court? Did he not appeal to the mobs, as he calls them? Did he not make speeches in the lobby to show how villainous that decision was and how it ought to be overthrown? Did he not succeed, too, in getting an act passed by the legislature to have it overthrown? The legislature passed an act to pack the state Supreme Court. And didn't he himself sit down on that bench as one of the 5 added judges who were to overturn the 4 old ones, getting his name of judge in that way and no other? Thundering cheers and laughter. If there is a villainy in using disrespect or making opposition to Supreme Court decisions, I commend it to Judge Douglas's earnest consideration. I know of no man in the state of Illinois who ought to know so well about how much villainy it takes to oppose a decision of the Supreme Court as our honorable friend Stephen A. Douglas. Now, in that excerpt, you see several things about Lincoln's voice. You see his storytelling. You see his wit. You see his enjoyment of the occasion. And you see his willingness to bring the attack ad hominem against his opponent, Judge Douglas. Lincoln often used analogies to great effect. Sometimes he used an extended analogy in order to try to prove the outlandish claim that there was a plot to spread slavery all over the country and that Douglas was part of the plot. Here's how he proved it. He said, "We cannot absolutely know that these exact adaptations are the result of pre-concert, but when we see a lot of framed timbers, different portions of which we know have been gotten out at different times and places and by different workmen, Stephen, Franklin, Roger, and James, for instance." Get all the first names. That's Douglas, President Pierce, President Buchanan, and Chief Justice Taney of the Supreme Court. And when we see these timbers joined together and see they exactly make the frame of a house or a mill, all the tenons and mortises exactly fitting, all the lengths and proportions of the different pieces exactly adapted to their respective places, not a piece too many or too few. Or if a single piece be lacking, we can see the place in the frame exactly fitted and prepared to bring it in. We find it impossible to not believe that Stephen and Franklin and Roger and James all understood one another from the beginning and all worked upon a common plan or draft drawn before the first lick was struck. That was actually originally in the House Divided speech, and then Lincoln quoted from it in the opening debate at Ottawa. Sometimes, however, his analogies were briefer. He had trouble dealing with the question of how he could be morally opposed to slavery and yet not be an abolitionist. And finally, in the last debate in Alton, he answered that question this way. He said, "You may have a wen or a cancer upon your person and not be able to cut it out lest you bleed to death. But surely it is no way to cure it, to engraft it and spread it over your whole body. That is no proper way of treating what you regard a wrong. And with that analogy, he captured in a nugget the essence of his argument that moral opposition to slavery led to a policy not of abolition that might destroy the Union, but of containment, keeping slavery where it currently was so that eventually it would die. Lincoln was precise in his language, another aspect of his voice that we remember. He would make critical distinctions. He was accused of being an advocate of Negro equality. And while that sounds just fine to us today, that would have been the kiss of death for a mainstream politician in Illinois in the 1850s. And so when he responded to Douglas in the opening debate about equality, he said, "I agree with Judge Douglas. He is not my equal in many respects." And listen to this. "Certainly not in color. Perhaps not in moral or intellectual endowment." Notice the word perhaps, which distances Lincoln from the claim. "But in the right to eat the bread without leave of anybody else, which his own hand earns, he is my equal and the equal of Judge Douglas and the equal of every living man." In short, there was equality and then there was equality. And by being precise, Lincoln was able to defend racial equality with respect to economics, the right to upward mobility, the right to eat what your own hand produces, and yet steer clear of the politically damaging charge that he favored social and political equality between the races, which he did not in 1858. Lincoln's most embarrassing statement came in the Charleston debate, embarrassing to us, when he said that he opposed social and political equality. He said this, "There's a physical difference between the white and black races, which will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." This is a very troubling statement for us, but I want to call attention to one thing about it, the word assigned. He is not saying that racial difference or racial hierarchy is genetic or biological or innate or unchangeable. It is assigned, which means that it is a social and cultural role. And finally, a final illustration, Lincoln was able to give voice to moral clarity. You might find it surprising. The debates were 21 hours long. We're going to hear excerpts from them later tonight. There's almost no discussion about the morality of slavery or its extension. And there's a variety of reasons why that's the case. But in the last couple of debates, Lincoln introduces that theme, and in his last speech in Alton, he brings the issue to a head when he says, "The real issue in this controversy, the one pressing upon every mind, is the sentiment on the part of one class that looks upon the institution of slavery as a wrong, and of another class that does not look upon it as a wrong." And he proceeds to argue that every difference between him and Douglas emanates from that basic difference in moral premise, that Douglas is willing to let slavery go on forever because he sees no moral wrong in it. So we come to a paradoxical sort of conclusion. On one hand, we have very little information about what Lincoln sounded like. On the other, we've got a lot of information about what he sounded like. We can see how in his extemporaneous as well as in his formal addresses, he put words together for great effect, displaying his wit, displaying his storytelling ability, displaying his ability to take potshots at Douglas, but also displaying his ability to focus and clarify the essential nature of the issue. Thank you.
What did Abraham Lincoln look like? We will get a glimpse, thanks to Dr. Bruce Lundberg, who's here this evening, Lincoln in painting, photography, and sculpture. A warm welcome.
My former roommate from Hamilton College, Steve Steinberg, who organized this symposium, and would be much better suited than I to be up here since he's the real historian between the two of us. The reason he invited me is because after college I became interested in the history of photography, and I'm a collector of photographic images, and I've always been interested and intrigued by Abraham Lincoln images, although I've never had the resources to really seriously invest in the area because it's a major undertaking. All of us in this room have a very strong sense of what Abraham looked like. In fact, we really can't get away from him. Steve, that's really all I have to say. One more thing, between late 1860 and 1861, after he was elected to the presidency, old Abe decided to grow a beard. Seriously, however, despite my own visual sense of Lincoln, his photographs have always been a jumble in my mind. After all, there's over 135 photographs of Lincoln, and we see them mixed and matched. We can certainly say he's beardless here, he has a beard there, but beyond that, I think a lot of us don't have a real sense of the sequence of Lincoln images. And what I've tried to do is to make a sense out of these images in both a chronological and a circumstantial way, so that we can pair the image with what was happening to Lincoln at that time. Beyond that, there is more to be seen in these portraits to help us understand why we recognize this person so well. He had a very distinctive look, which was then and still is now part of our fascination with the man. This beardless pose of Lincoln from 1859, Lincoln, the lawyer, and Lincoln, the Lincoln-Douglas debater, shows us, I think, in a very graphic way, the features of Lincoln's face. He had a very, very large, he had a very large head, a 7 1/4 hat size. He had very coarse hair with deeply receded hairlines. He had a very prominent widow's peak. Lincoln's eyes were set very deeply in his skull. He had very bushy and large and mobile eyebrows. He had huge ears. He had a very lined and craggy face. He had a very, very high cheekbone and a very recessed temporalis fossa where the below his hair, and a very hollowed out cheek below that cheekbone. In addition, he had a very prominent muscle that originates on the zygomatic bone, or the cheekbone, and goes to the muscle that inserts around the mouth. And this was also very mobile on his face. He had a extremely prominent philtrum, which is this ovoid depression from the base of the nasal septum to the middle of the upper lip. And the upper lip had a very pronounced, what's called Cupid's bow. And a philtrum is a Greek word for a love potion. So we can see where the early anatomists are coming from when it comes to their description of the face. His lower lip on the right side was thickened, and we see that very often in a lot of the photographs. There's a very prominent unpigmented mole on his right nasolabial fold, and that comes out repeatedly in all of the photographs. Another very prominent aspect of his face and his skull is that his upper skull was quite large, but he had a very narrow jaw, and it was extremely squared off. Lastly, he had a very thin neck and a very prominent Adam's apple, and I understand he had a very high-pitched voice, but one would have thought in looking at the anatomy that he would have a deep voice. A contemporary of Lincoln's described the face as having a battered look and an expression of sadness. Now, Lincoln's physique was equally unique. He was a very tall man, especially for the time. He was 6'4" in height. He was extremely sinewy. He weighed only 185 pounds. He was lanky, even gawky. Nathaniel Hawthorne. There's no describing his lengthy awkwardness, nor the uncouthness of his movement. He had very long arms and had very big hands, long legs and big feet. The caricaturist David Levine for the New York Review of Books has put together these features, I think, extremely well, as only a caricaturist can do. The very deep receding hairline, the very big cranium, the bushy hair, the huge ears, the deep-seated eyes, and the bushy eyebrows, especially his left eyebrow was quite mobile in many of the pictures. And then he had almost no, very small lower face and a squared-off jaw. We can almost not see the neck connecting to the body in this caricature, and then the body is long and thin. Now, we're very fortunate with Abraham Lincoln that we have so many images of him, and in fact, he was the first president to be significantly photographed and also to understand the power of photography in terms of his image. The earliest we have is of the young Abe just finding his way from 1846 when he was only 37 years of age. Remember that the daguerreotype was first invented in 1840, so this is a very early image, and it's from Springfield, where there were 2 daguerreotypists at that time. This, to me, is one of the most striking images of the early Lincoln. This was photographed by a man with a terrific name of Polycarp von Snido. This is a daguerreotype, but unfortunately the daguerreotype has been lost, and this is a copy of that print. We see the rough and ready country boy dressed up. He was a wrestler as a youth, and we can see how strong he probably was at that time. He described himself as half alligator and half buffalo. And although he was an extremely confident person, he was also very self-conscious of his appearance, and he continually made fun of his appearance, describing himself as being homely and on many occasions. Now, if we go 4 years beyond this, from 54 to 58, we see a slightly different Lincoln. This is the Lincoln of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He's 49 years of age. He's actually, in this photograph, just defended a family friend's son who had been accused of murder, a man named Duff Armstrong. And the eyewitness who put him in the victim's yard saw him at 11 o'clock at night. And Lincoln brought out the Farmer's Almanac and showed that the moon had set already at quarter of 11. And I think that the movie, My Cousin Vinny, took a page from Lincoln's playbook for this. I think this is one of the most striking and beautiful images of the young, unbearded Lincoln. It's an image that we don't see enough. And he's in this white linen jacket, I think partly because it doesn't fit with our image of Lincoln. And I think the historians have a hard time in putting this together with some of the other aspects of Lincoln. But I think this is a wonderful image. Now, at about the same time, Lincoln was photographed by a man named Alexander Hessler, who was a very famous photographer from Chicago. This is called the tousled hair pose. He was running for the Senate, running for the nomination for the Senate, which he was able to get. He ran against his nemesis, Stephen Douglas, and Douglas actually beat him in this election, and I think perhaps it might be because of this photograph. What do you think? Now, after Lincoln had won the nomination by the Republican Party for the presidency, the politicos of the Republican Party thought they needed to get an image that was better than what was out there, and they called Hessler back in and gave him a second chance. And I think that we can see that Hessler produced a wonderful pair of images of Lincoln. As in the previous photograph, Hessler was very intrigued by Lincoln's profile. And I think that most of us in our collective understanding of what Lincoln looked like probably fall back to this image. It's one that's very frequently reproduced. In fact, after Hessler died, a man named Ayres bought out Hessler's studio and started to reproduce these photographs after 1881. And there are many Ayres, Hessler photographs of Lincoln that come on the market. In general, people who collect Lincoln want Lincoln images when he was alive. So the fact that these images, though very beautiful, are not during his lifetime, their value is a lot less than a contemporary image of Lincoln. I should say also that Lincoln was very happy with his pose. That looks better and expresses me better than any I have ever seen. And his law partner and biographer Herndon described this as a pose of the head so essentially Lincolnian, no other artist has ever caught it. Now, Lincoln knew he had to come east as a presidential candidate and face the eastern electorate, no, the people who had to elect him. And he was invited east by Cooper Union. And the Cooper Union speech is one of his most famous speeches. Let us have faith that right makes right. And I think that I would hope that George Bush might think that might makes right is not the way to go. You can see the day before the famous Cooper Union speech, he went to Matthew Brady's studio. And at this point, Matthew Brady was a photographer and a daguerreotypist for almost 20 years. I think that Brady immediately realized what he had to do with Lincoln. He saw Lincoln and he said, well, we don't want to include those long legs, and he cut the legs off. He wanted the arms to be rested, and he also wanted to pull the cuff out to cover up the hand and to reduce the impact of the length of the arms. He didn't want him standing straight forward, but twisted his body slightly. You can see that he pulled the collar up so he can't even see the neck. And he turned the head and told Lincoln not to look at the camera, but to gaze off as a sort of a visionary. And this image by Matthew Brady was one of the things, as well as the speech, that put Lincoln in the White House. Now, at about this time, after he was elected, as I said earlier, and before he came east, he was already elected president, he decided to grow a beard. And we can see in this sequence from November of 1860 until February of 1861 that Abe puts on the beard, and a local newsman commented, "Old Abe is putting on airs." And Abe himself, who was self-conscious, asked the question, do you think people will call it a piece of silly affectation? This is a remarkable set of two photographs by the same photographer, Gurman, in Springfield, Illinois, and about a month apart. And obviously, Lincoln during this period had not visited the barber. And I think this image is pretty scary. I think he decided after that to trim it down a little bit. Now, as we all know, he got on a train, boarded a train, and he came east. He went through Philadelphia. He had some problems in Baltimore, and he came into Washington, D.C. And within a day, he was in a studio, in fact, Brady's Washington studio, getting photographed. Now, while there, he met the then manager of the Brady's Washington studio, Alexander Gardner. We can see that there was a series of images of him, all of them sitting down at this table, all of them looking very stiff and preoccupied. In fact, one famous image, he's holding a pocket watch, and I think he's saying, when is this going to be over? I just wanted to show that this is what's called a carte de visite, and this would be a large, either a mammoth plate or an 8x10 photograph, but this is a carte de visite. And during the Civil War period, this was the most prominent form of photograph that was available. It was collected. There was a real mania for the carte de visite. Now after this, after his inauguration in March, for almost a year, there were very few images of Lincoln. I think he was obviously preoccupied with his job. He had a lot to do. But during this period, he started to ponder the issue of freeing the slaves, when and how to do it. And this image, which was actually taken in the Brady studio of Lincoln, shows a different picture of Lincoln. We see Lincoln very self-calculating and a very skeptical and wily appearing Lincoln. In fact, I think this is Lincoln the politician. And this image is always teamed with, put together with the Emancipation Proclamation. So this is sort of the emancipator, the great emancipator. This is the image. Now most of the images from that, so this was a mammoth plate. This was like 18 by 20, very large picture with a negative. It would have been a direct print of the large glass negative. But this is a carte de visite. And I just wanted to demonstrate that Lincoln had signed this carte de visite on the front of the image. And this is what collectors are looking for. In fact, the signature itself is probably more valuable than the photograph. So a carte de visite like this without the photograph would be one expense, maybe $200 or $300, but with his signature, it goes up into the many thousands of dollars. This image, you can see, has been trimmed down, as many of the images were, because they put the images in albums during this period of time. And the trimmed down image loses some of its collector quality. Now, for reasons that Brady was a manipulator, Brady was a businessman, Brady wanted all the credit for everything he did, and even though most of the photographs that were taken by Brady were not done by him, and he didn't want to acknowledge the photographers. And in Gardner's case, Gardner couldn't work with that, so Gardner broke with Brady. And Gardner opened his own gallery in the summer of 1863. And to demonstrate the relationship that had developed between the two of them, Lincoln came to Gardner's new gallery the day before it opened. And he had a series of photographs taken on this sitting. All of them show a very relaxed pose and a confident-looking and contemplative Lincoln. Lincoln penned a note to Gardner after this session, and he said that he felt that this image of his arm leaning on his head was the most pleasing of all the images he had seen prior to that time. Again, Gardner, this image of Lincoln is just a week and a half prior to the Gettysburg Address. And this image of Lincoln is Lincoln, the commander-in-chief. And this image is one that we see he's extremely confident. He knows he can do the job, and he's going to accomplish his task. Just wanted to show you here that this image very clearly shows that lazy left eye. There's no manipulation here at all. He's sitting directly, looking into the camera. In fact, he looks like he's looking through all of us. His two secretaries, John Nicolay and John Hay, were also at the session with him, and a photograph was taken, a very regal-looking Lincoln from the same setting. This is a very dramatic picture that we see very often reproduced. As Lincoln said, he had a way of getting up as far as possible in the world, referring to his hair. Now, there's a series of photographs by Anthony Berger, and in fact, the image that's on the front of the program is by Berger, and this is the $5 Lincoln. I was recently at an exhibition, and I realized that they had switched in 2000. They switched the image to a different one from Berger's sitting. I'm going to show you. Now, in that same sitting with Berger, he was with his son Tad, and this is in February of 1864. And he's very comfortable here. This is the only image of him with glasses. And then 1 year later, in February of 1865, look at the difference in the appearance of Lincoln. Tad had obviously grown up some, but Lincoln had gone through a devastating year. And this image is one of Lincoln the martyr. And I think that this is one of the most haunting images in the history of photography, and in fact the history of our nation and the history of art. And this image, I think, is all of us have seen and felt the impact of Lincoln at the end of his presidency and just before he was assassinated. Thank you.